Hey guys, it's Craig at Area 419. I'm excited to join you and share with you our class on the core elements of precision rifle reloading. If you're watching this on YouTube and this is the full-length, all-everything video, know that you could have seen this months before if you were part of our Team Area 419 Patreon channel. If you're interested in that, drop down the description below and you're going to find a link to it. We'd love to see you there. As we get into these core elements of precision rifle reloading, I want to make clear what our goal is here. We want anybody watching this video with any basic understanding of what reloading is to be able to take what we're teaching here and turn their reloading practices, whether they are long developed or just beginning, into something that's going to be more consistent and lead them to what may be higher performing precision match ammunition for their rifle. This is not bulk reloading 101. We're not going to figure out how to save an extra penny a piece on a 5.56 or a 9mm load. There's a lot of content for that, and that's a great way to reload. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're going to use premium tools, high-end components, and take extra steps to make sure that the ammunition that we are producing here is really, really good. Really is as good as anybody could make. Now, there are going to be times that we talk about a practice or an idea or a method here that you might not agree with, and that's okay. There's no one way to do this. If you jump into a forum on 6MMBR or on an F-class page or in a PRS page, you're gonna find more opinions than people on how somebody might or might not reload. So these are the best practices that we've found in our own competitive shooting journeys that produce pretty good ammo. And if you've got an idea of something that can be done differently, that's why we're here. Drop something in the comments, or if you're on Patreon, drop it in the forum there. And let's discuss what has worked for you and what maybe hasn't. As we walk through these elements, we're going to talk about how we prep our brass. That's actually 2 sections. We're going to talk about how we prime, how we charge, how we seat, some tips and tricks along the way on how we find critical data points, and ultimately what we like to do with our ammo after. We're not going to cover a few things, and we're going to tell you why. Please understand that reloading is inherently dangerous. We're going to work through a process here that is going to ultimately result in putting a loaded round of ammunition into the chamber of a rifle, pulling the trigger, and sparking an explosion which drives a projectile at give or take 3,000 feet per second. Again, this can be dangerous. So understand that we're not going to talk to you about setting a charge weight or finding one. Your powder manufacturer is the best way to find that information. Also understand that by watching this video and doing anything that we show you, you are assuming the risk that comes in reloading. It's something that we know can be done very well, but also always will have inherent danger. Firearms are tools, but they do include risks. So understand that when you get into reloading, you are taking some of that risk into your own hand. And guys, here we go. We're going to get into the core elements of precision rifle reloading from Area 419, one at a time. And the next thing we're going to get into, we're going to talk about brass prep. As we get into the core elements of precision rifle reloading, the first thing we're going to do is talk about what do we do with this. This is a piece of recently fired brass from my 6GT, like I just picked it up from a firing line. We have to start here, and ultimately we're going to end with this piece of brass ready to go, loaded up, back to the match. So what do we do first? Well, it's dirty. The first step that I like to take in the reloading process is I like to clean brass. When we clean brass, our preferred method of doing it is in a dry tumbler with corn cob or walnut media. There's some other medias that people may use, but those are the common ones, and they tend to work fairly well. I also like to put just a little bit of like a Flitz's polish in with the reloading media. This helps the process take a little bit less time, and it leaves a nice finish on the brass that I know is not going to tarnish or cause any problems downstream in this process. You'll note I did not say we are going to wet tumble. So through hard-learned experience, wet tumbling is something that, unless you are paying a lot of attention to every single thing, may not be right for you. Wet tumbling has 2 real ill side effects. One, those pins can be really annoying. They can stick in places, they can get sideways, they can bunch inside a case. But the other problem, and the bigger problem, is if you leave your brass in a wet tumbler for an extended period of time, or really just clean it a lot through several firings of that same process, you'll tend to roll over or peen your necks. And if you know what that looks like, it would be around the mouth of your case. You would get a little bit of a bulb that would form all the way around the mouth. This comes from those pins or that media beating against the end of the case and rounding off that nice edge that you should have on the front of a mouth. If this is on the outside or on the inside, you can run into pressure issues fairly quickly. I speak from experience too, as a guy who left brass in a wet tumbler for too long, got distracted, was here at the shop, came back to it and found a lot of brass that was either going to require a ton of work from me or it was just going to go in the trash can. So wet tumbling is something that a lot of people might like because your brass comes out super bright, super shiny. But in our opinion, if you're a reloader that wants to be able to spend their time more efficiently and worry about a few less things, we like dry tumbling of our brass. Once that brass is clean, we think an important next step, and we'd suggest you do it every time if you have something like an annealese or an annealing made perfect that does it really simply and consistently, is anneal your brass. The reason that you would anneal brass is it is going to soften that brass to a consistent hardness or softness every single time. The nature of brass is as you work that brass, and that is the expansion and contraction specifically of that neck when you fire and resize. As you work that brass will do what's called work hardening. That means that your brass becomes harder and over time more brittle simply by using it over and over. Annealing relieves that stress and is going to give you longer lasting brass necks and is also going to give you more consistent neck tension time over time. You may not think you need to do this every time. You probably don't. But doing it every time as a matter of practice is going to get you a more consistent process and more consistent results downstream. So here we are at the annealer. We want to soften the necks of this brass. There's a lot of information you can get about the benefits of annealing from somebody like Annealing Made Perfect. I know what the code is on the AMP Mark II, the Aztec code, based on having gone through and sacrificed a piece of brass to understand that. I've got the correct pilot in. I've got a shell holder on their little unit. Let's anneal some brass. It's pretty simple. When you're doing your annealing, make sure that you are using a container as a dump container that is metallic. If you use a plastic container, you're going to figure out very quickly that annealing works through getting your brass really hot, really fast. And if you put that piece of brass in a non-metallic or non-heat-proof container, it's not going to last very long. Now that our brass is clean and it's annealed, it's ready to be sized. All right, our piece of brass is clean and it's been annealed. Now it's time to size it. The reason we have to size our brass is after you fire it and that explosion happens inside the brass and it expands to meet your chamber, it doesn't shrink all the way back down. It shrinks just enough that you can extract it cleanly, go to the next round. If you ever try to rechamber a freshly fired piece of brass, it's going to be pretty sticky. You may be able to get it to close, but it's not going to feel the way that you want it to. You're also going to be left with virtually no neck tension. So if I were to take a projectile and push it into this case right now, I would get little to no resistance at all. Obviously, this is not ready to reload. As we go through the sizing process, understand that this is all built around the idea of full length sizing. There's also something you'll hear about called neck sizing. This sizes only the neck of the case to where you get that neck tension back and you can hold a projectile, and it doesn't worry about the growth of the case, specifically the shoulder relative to the chamber. There was a time a little bit longer ago, you'll typically not find this being done so often now, where only sizing the neck led to longer life in brass. With advancements in brass, with advancements in the way that we're managing it, the way that we're sizing it, the way that we're annealing it and caring for it, we think that you are going to get more consistency time to time with a full length size. The tough part about neck sizing is you might be able to neck size a piece of brass a couple times, but eventually that shoulder is going to grow enough that it's not going to be nice or smooth or easy to chamber inside your rifle. And at that point, you'll need to full length size or bump your shoulder back. If you're only doing that every so often, that means that each time that you fire, your brass is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be appropriately sized and then a little bit longer and a little bit longer until you size again, and then it's going to go back. Again, this is inconsistency that we don't like to introduce to the process. We prefer full length sizing. If you need to find somebody else to convince you, go ask that Eric Cortina guy. He's pretty worked up about it. Now that we've established we're talking full length sizing, we're going to head to the reloading bench. We're going to get some brass, we're going to set up our sizing die, we're going to size some brass, and we'll talk you through that process from there. Now that we're ready to get to the bench and do some sizing, let's first talk about how we lubricate our cases. I like to use Hornady One Shot. There's great products from Alpha, there's Imperial Sizing Wax, there's a lot of different ways to do it. I'm just going to share how I've done it for quite some time. I will take my brass and put it in a used MTM box or like the nice black plastic boxes that Alpha Brass comes in, and I sit it mouth up in the box. And then With that box, I take one shot. I usually put it in another larger container so that I can move it and not make a mess. I take that one shot and I shoot in downward from about a 45-degree angle, apply, rotate that box 90 degrees, hit it again, go all the way around, so that all the way around that case, I have applied lubrication inside the neck, outside the neck, and on the shoulder. From there, I'll take all that brass, I'll dump it back into that larger container, hit it with a little more spray, shake it, and make sure I've got a nice coating around the outside of that case. So with lubricated cases, let's get into setting up our die. I'm using one of our M-Series sizing dies in 6GT, obviously. So with that die loosely in, I'm gonna run the ram up. I got just a little touch. I'm gonna run that die in about another 3/8 or so turn until I feel like there's nice pressure there. And with pressure in, I'm gonna lock down that die. Now that I've locked that with the ring, I'm gonna go ahead and snug it up. Now I'm gonna take the top portion of my die, run it down. You want that nice and tight. Again, snug. The outside of the body is set. Now we're going to set our micrometer top. So I make sure that's out nice and far. And until I've got upward pressure on the die, and I'm going to crank down my micrometer until it stops. This is probably going to size my brass from fired about 8 thousandths. I'm making a good guess there. I'm gonna go ahead and back that off. About 4 thousandths. That'll probably be a little more size than I want, but it gives us an opportunity to adjust. Once I've got the die set up in a rough size, I'm gonna take my caliper here with a comparator tool on it and start to get measurements of how long these pieces of brass are to the datum line on the shoulder. So I'll take my first piece of brass, put it in spin, and I'm gonna zero my caliper on that piece of brass. I'm gonna grab a couple more and check them. Zeroed out. So the next one will be zeroed as well. And that'll give us a good starting point for where our brass is. This is our fired brass length. This is what we could expect any piece of brass fired in that firing cycle to come out at. Now we're gonna size. All right, now we go in with that same caliper, set the same way. We get a measurement. Looks like I'm not quite getting enough sizing here. This is roughly the same size. So I'm gonna walk this in, let's say 3 thousandths at a time. See if that one got us there. So with 3 thousandths of walk in, we've got 2 thousandths of shoulder bump. So I was a thousandth off to begin with. We're gonna size a couple more pieces, confirm that length, and that's how we size brass. So the brass is now sized. We're off the bench. We know that we bumped our shoulders back about 2 thousandths, and we're where we want to be from a dimensional size of the brass. Except sometimes you need to trim brass. This isn't something you necessarily need to do all the time. Depending on the cartridge that you are reloading, there is a specified trim length and a max length. These are different lengths, obviously, because it accounts for some sort of growth of the case over time. If you're using something with a very sharp shoulder, like a 6-dasher, it's gonna grow on that neck substantially less than if you're using something with a pretty long neck or a shallow taper on that shoulder, let's say a 243. It's the nature of brass flow, so this may not be something that applies to you often, but occasionally you may need to trim your necks. This is also relevant if you're a person that likes to chamfer and or deburr your cases every time. For us, we like to use a Giro trimmer. It does all three of these things at one time. We're not gonna go into a lot of depth about how we set up that trimmer. Rather, we just wanna show you what that process looks like when it's determined that you need it. Some people might wanna kiss it through the trimmer every single time. We don't. We kind of make a judgment call of when the brass needs it, but here's what that process looks like. I've got the Gerard set up here. I know in this 6GT, I'm not really gonna get any overall length trim, but what I will get is a little bit of chamfer on the inside of the neck, and if I've got some sort of issue on the outside of the neck, I'll get a little bit of deburr. Again, this is a Gerard. This is This is a great trimmer. It's one of the industry standards. Henderson also makes a really good product. You can also do this with a hand trimmer. It's just going to take quite a bit of time. If you're not into overall length trimming, if you don't think that's something that's going to be a heavy requirement, if you've got a piece of brass like that, you can use some of the all-in-one prep stations that have the inside chamfer, outside deburr, and maybe the case length thing. There's like a Frankfurt Arsenal product or something like that. But this is one we've had on the bench for quite some time and really like it. So let's trim a couple pieces of brass. It's a fast, easy process. You can just feel that cutting tool start to kiss the inside of the neck, and I can see it here with a little bit of sheen. Again, it's not doing very much. We're just making sure there's not some imperfection in the brass that's going to cause a problem when we seat that bullet. Now that we've got our trimming done, before we go to priming, I want to add a really important step here. Now, this is something that I will intuitively do at different points throughout the process, and I suggest you do them at all points that you can in the process, but I'm going to take an extra visual inspection of the cases. Before we prime these cases, we want to make sure there's nothing in them, there's no obstruction, and there's no massive failure in the case. Typically, this can look like something simple. I'm looking down in the cases, making sure there's no tumbling media or anything down in there, or there's nothing that's gotten caught in the process. It's a simple step. I suggest you do it several times throughout the process. Really, anytime you're handling the case, be aware of what's around you. Feel for imperfections, look for imperfections, and make sure there's not something compromised in that brass. All right, so our brass is clean, it's annealed, it's sized, it's trimmed, and it's ready to be treated like it's a new piece of brass. If you've been watching this all along and you're sitting here with a box of new brass wondering how does this apply to me, well, it hasn't so far. But after you fire that piece of brass, you're going to need those. So anyway, we've got this piece of brass. It's ready to go. Let's talk about the things that we do after. How do we prime it? How do we get it ready for seating? How do we talk about charging? We've got a lot more to go. All right, so we've got our fully prepped piece of brass. It's been cleaned, annealed, sized, trimmed, and it's ready to be reloaded. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to prime this case. Priming cases is something that can be as more or less complicated as you'd like it to be, but the core of this is the primer is your ignition source in this piece of brass. It's what your firing pin strikes. It's what creates that first pop that ignites your powder. There are two ways to do this. One is the easy handheld way, and the other one is a little more intricate and is going to involve something that sits on your bench. I've reloaded a lot of ammo with a hand primer, and I really also like to reload, and I like the convenience of a primal rights unit. There are pros and cons to both. Basically, you are spending money to split hairs, and there's nothing wrong with that. So we're going to go to the bench. We're going to talk through some priming. We're going to do a little bit of priming, and then we're going to talk about what comes after. I've primed a lot of cases on an RCBS Universal, the hand squeeze. It's a great way to do it. It's an inexpensive way to do it. A really nice way to do it, though, and one that's convenient. It does a really good, consistent job, and it's got some adjustability, is the Primal Rights seater. So as we seat, I've got primers, some 205Ms in the tube, and we're ready to prime. Not a great deal of difficulty to it. We put a case in, you prime it. Got a primer. I like to now put them in the loading block that I'm going to use when I charge those cases, and we work through. Put another primer in, make sure it's there, seat, visual inspection, into the case. So we've got primers in our cases. We're ready to move over to the charging area. So again, we took that brass off the range, we cleaned it, we annealed it, we decapped and sized, trimmed, we have now primed. We've been visually inspecting along the way. It's time to go to powder. So guys, till we get to the next one. Something we're not going to do here is talk to you about charge weight. Powder is something that you can really get yourself into trouble with. If you use way too much, you can run into issues. If you don't use enough, you can run into issues. Fortunately, every powder manufacturer that you're going to be getting powder from should, and if they don't, ask them, publish a starting load for the powder that you'd like to use and the cartridge that you'd like to use it in. A lot of you may think, well, that's silly. I'm not using a starting load. Hey, internet, what's my max load? Don't do that. That's silly. So as you get into this, use the starting loads that come recommended from the powder manufacturer. You can obviously work up from there. Again, they're starting loads. And we'll talk in a different video about how to identify pressure signs, how to water test, some of those other things. We're not going to do them here. So let's head to the reloading bench. We're going to throw some charges, and we're going to get these things charged up and ready for projectiles. All right, guys, we're here to charge. I've already got my auto trickler set up. It's already throwing charges for me. A lot of the nuance in charging really comes in load development and deciding what that charge is going to be. We're not getting into that in this video. We'll likely do something on load development at a later time. That's not what we're doing here. What I'm going to talk about are some tools and then some practices that make this reduce error and reduce mess. So I've got the cases that we're going to charge in one of our loading blocks. I've got my Area 419 funnel with a 6mm head on it, since this is GT. And obviously, I think this is a Auto Trickler V3 that we have kitted out. Could be a V2. The differences were pretty minimal. As I pull charges, something I like to do is always have my funnel on an empty case. That means after I throw a charge, powder's in, that's recharging. Now I'm going to make sure that I've visually inspected that case. There's one charge of powder in it, and then I'm moving my funnel. That way, once the funnel is moved, and this is recharged again, I know that I'm pouring one charge per case. And again, I'm gonna move that to the next one, and I know I have an empty one to pour into. While double charging can be a huge problem in the pistol world, in the rifle world, it's pretty difficult to double charge since a single charge is going to be 90, 95, 100% case fill anyway. But a double charge does cause a huge mess on the bench. If you get two charges in, there's a lot left in your funnel, you pick it up, there's powder everywhere. So as we move through, I charge, I replace the cup into the powder dispenser, I move the funnel, make sure everything's okay. I'll go through all this and eventually move it over to the seating portion, but that's really what we have going on the charging side. Take your time, visual inspection, and don't make a mess. All right, so our cases are charged, they've got powder in them, they're ready for projectiles. Now we need to know how deep we want to seat our bullets. Well, there's a lot of tools for this. You'll hear a lot of methodology for doing this. I'm going to share with you how I've done it for years, and it takes no tools, and it's super repeatable, and it's not gonna cost you anything. So let's head over to the vise. I'm gonna take apart a bolt, and I'm gonna work you through the process of finding your lands. This is a method that I think the first time I saw it done was in a YouTube video done by Wheeler Engineering. It's a common way to do it. It takes a little bit of expertise, but is actually pretty limited on the tools required to do it. So I've got my match rifles right here, but I've got the bolt out of it. We've got to take the ejector plunger out of the bolt so that we don't get any false readings. We're going to do that really quickly. I'm going to show you that process in some brevity, and then we're going to get into some trial and error, basically walking back the seating depth of the bullet until we find a seating depth that is just a kiss on the lands. As I try to take this bolt apart, I'm going to first take the fire control group out. Depending on which action you have, how that fire control group comes apart can be different. This is off of a Defiance, an old Deviant. Got that out. Now I'm going to hold my bolt so that I can drift out the pin that has the ejector plunger. As I start to come through, note that I move my hand to the other side, because if you spend enough time disassembling items under load on a rifle, you know that as soon as you forget to do that, everything becomes a projectile. So, got my ejector plunger out. That spring's still in there. I'm going to reach in with the punch, pull that spring. Anytime you do this, it's a great time to grease and clean your ejector plunger, the spring. It's just good care and maintenance. So now that I have my bolt fully disassembled, I've got the extractor claw still in because that's going to become useful as we go through this process. Some guys may tell you to pull it out. That's kind of a preferential thing. It's plausible that you could get a little bit of a different feel, but I've always left it in. Rifle in the vise and held. Now I'm going to take an unprimed case, and the projectile that I'm going to use, I'm going to go to the press, and I'm going to seat it at a depth that I know is too long, but we want that. We want our initial seating in this test to be too long. All right, now with this case, I'm going to put it into the bolt, and grab it with the extractor claw, put it in, and I note when I get to right here, I've got a little bit of a touch. See how this bolt doesn't want to fall down? If I were to take the case out, put the bolt in, as I push it in, it just falls down like that. So anything that keeps the bolt from moving in that manner is resistance that's caused by the projectile kissing the lands. So what I'm gonna do is 5 thousandths at a time, go back and forth to the press. I'm gonna seat this bullet just a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper until we get to the point of thinking that we're really close. You'll be able to feel that difference. Okay, so right here is a feel that's important. I just went down that 10 thousandths. As I got the bolt in, it wanted to start falling, and with very little pressure, I'm able to move it down. Again, it's not seating cleanly, but we're really close. So now I'm gonna walk back, and I'm just gonna do like 3 thousandths. Okay, so as I got this case to a length that I like, I know that when I insert, I'm going to get to size and feel no engagement of the rifling as we move up and down. Now, of course, this isn't in full free fall because there's a case in there, and that little bit of ability for the case itself to interact with the chamber wall is there. But when I'm here, I'm feeling no pull of that projectile back out of the lands. So what I can know is that at my current seating depth, this is what I would consider a kiss or a one-off seating depth. So I'm roughly 1 thousandths off the lands. So knowing that this is a 108 ELD, I know that a good space to start my seating depth testing would be at like 50 thousandths. I'm gonna head back to the bench. I'm going to add 50 thousandths of seating depth to my seating die, and we're gonna seat some projectiles. So what I'm doing from that point where the bullet just kissed the rifling is I have already screwed in the micrometer head 50 thousandths. This means that when we ignite this round, that bullet will travel 50 thousandths of an inch before it engages the rifling. Seating depth tests and things like that are something you can get into. I just know with this bullet, about 50 thousandths is going to give me a pretty good result most of the time, so it's a good starting point for me. So our die is set. We have thrown our powder. It's already in the cases. We're ready to go. Now, seating bullets is the simple part. What I like to do before I get into it is set projectiles in the top of the ready-to-seat cases, and then I just work my way through a line. I can feel comfortable that the bullets are going to seat the same way every time, and once we're to this point, guys, it's all easy sailing. I'll pull them one at a time, often starting from the back. Seat that bullet. It's ready to go. So catch us in the next one. We're going to go through some aftercare, how we get this ammunition ready for a match, and some other generic things that we thought about along the way because, guys, this has been a fairly long video series. We certainly forgot something. All right, so we got our ammo and it's ready to go. We started with a dirty used case from a match. We went through the whole process, and now this piece of ammo, it's ready to go again. But something that I would suggest you do is think about what happens now that we have these loaded rounds. First thing I like to do with them is I like to make a mark on my brass inside the extractor groove. I've known people that color-coded brass based on how many firings it had on it. I just want to mark it something that's not the same as any of my buddies that I'm going to shoot with, so that if we're all shooting GT or we're all shooting Dasher or whatever we're all shooting, it's easy for us to identify whose brass belongs to who. Good way to do this. There are several tools that are out there. Gray Ops makes a cool one. You'll find various 3D printed ones, lots of different ways to do it. In general, I like to mark my brass inside the extractor groove. That keeps there from being any product or ink or goo that gets inside my chamber and sticks out. It's also good at this point, before you put this into something like an ammo box or maybe an ammo novel from Coltac, grab a microfiber cloth and just wipe them. After the sizing process, there may be a little bit of lubricant that's left over. If you haven't cleaned it off or didn't wipe it after that process, even though we told you to, maybe you do that again. It's another thing to do to take care of it. Ammo should also last you a little while. I mean, the idea of galvanic corrosion sticking your neck to your projectile, it's real, it's possible. We don't know that it's something that you need to be worried about. Most of us anyway are doing this sort of reloading the night before we leave for a match. So a lot of fresh ammo is the best ammo people out there. But in general, take care of your ammo. You worked really hard to make this a really nice piece of ammunition. Store it in a hard box or a designed soft product. You'll occasionally see somebody walking around with all their ammo loose in a bag. Those people are madmen, mostly named Robert Brantley. Obviously, he's had results from it. Makes me a little queasy, but again, do your own thing. Take care of your ammo. Little piece of advice: if you're flying with ammo, put it in a hard box. I know people that have had ammo taken away by TSA because they had it in some sort of binder or novel or bag. If you're flying with it, either put it in a hard box or maybe a used factory ammo container. Make sure you care for it well. So guys, we've walked you through everything we do in taking brass from fresh fired to ready to go again. What would you have done differently? Or what's a tip or a trick that we didn't outline that maybe you'd like to know more about? Something you saw us do, something you do at home. We want this to be a discussion and we want this to be a forum. We think these are the core principles of reloading, but we know we haven't hit it all. We never can, we never will. And as much as we aspire to, that's not the reality of reloading, and I really think that's why so many of us love it. We appreciate you tuning into this, being a part of what we're doing here. If you're watching this on Patreon as part of Team Area 419, we very much appreciate this. And if you're seeing this on YouTube, drop them in the comments below. But really, you should probably be on that Patreon page. Check it out in the link in the descriptions. Thanks for being with us. We hope you've learned something.